Welcome to our stupa series number 7. Time is fleeting. We are already on number 7. And today we have a very, very special guest for the topic, Replenish the Desert, Restore the Earth. I would like to welcome Travis Mueller. I use the German pronunciation, Mueller. I think in English it's Mueller. How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, we pronounce it Mueller, but you're pronouncing it correctly.
And Travis is a landscape designer. He is working at the University of Arizona and also for a lot of other very famous companies. And the reason why we are working together with Travis is that also the reforestation, the greening up Diamond Mountain is a big part which we want to accomplish. It's really restoring the earth, which many generations of humans have destroyed, and we want to just green it up again for the animals which are living in the desert. We hope that they are then coming back and living there again. And also for all visitors of the stupas, so that they have a very lush experience, that they have shady places, and that this will make the pilgrimage a much, much pleasant experience in an environment which has been restored to its original state. So with this, Travis, the stage is yours. Please educate us.
All righty. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen, but as I do that, kind of semi-reintroduce myself and just sort of introduce where we're going to go with this conversation. As mentioned, I teach at the University of Arizona in the School of Landscape Architecture. I've been working in the field of landscape architecture now for about 10 years. I've had many opportunities to work with designers that care about sustainable landscape design, and in particular, design an environment to create landscapes that are of their context, that they're of their place, and use the proper plants and methodologies for creating sustainable landscapes over the years. And so this project in particular, I've been really excited about and have been enjoying working with Diamond Mountain as we move towards a really interesting and exciting project. So I come at this conversation, this idea of replenishing the desert or regreening the desert, or even conversations of reforestation. That's not necessarily a term I'm going to use directly in this presentation, from the perspective of a designer.
Can you slow down a little bit, please? Thank you.
No, that's okay. I'll try not to say too many words too. From the perspective of a designer. And so that will be sort of the perspective that you see throughout this presentation. So as we get started, I thought I would share this quote from an author named Craig Childs, where he says, "There are two easy ways to die in the desert. There's thirst and there's drowning," which of course are opposing concepts of the way water exists in the landscape. And you'll note the term scarcity on the bottom left and the terms plenty on the right there. These images show you both the dryness of the desert as well as the incredible amount of rainwater and moisture that we can experience at certain times. And it's this idea of scarcity and plenty that really drives a lot of the ideas and concepts that I'm going to show you in this talk. Where we'll start is just a very short, sort of brief context conversation about where Diamond Mountain is situated. There's, of course, a lot more material on Diamond Mountain's website and even personal research that could be spent understanding geography, geology, etc. around. But I just want to briefly discuss this. I share this photo because this is the image that you're struck with when you stand on the Laurel campus of Diamond Mountain Retreat Center. We can see the pure beauty of this landscape that's formed by certain textures of the types of plants that thrive here and live here. But then, of course, the landforms that embrace the space and create a backdrop of beauty. Diamond Mountain stands in the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains and also stands at the juncture of 4 major regions listed there, Madre and Rocky Mountain, in particular, the ones that I believe impact the site the most are the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts. And because of this identity, one of the things that's exciting about a landscape like this for a landscape designer such as myself is the great amount of opportunity we have in terms of palette. Though limited to its region, is diverse and can be defined by these particular vegetative qualities that I've noted here, such as desert grassland, chaparral, and riparian woodland corridors.
Can you explain these terms a little bit more, especially chaparral and riparian woodland?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about Diamond Mountain is that most of these vegetative communities overlay each other. And so there's not distinct, clear marked areas, but this refers to, so desert grassland refers to those areas that are heavily populated with native grasses, of course, sparse plantings of trees. Chaparral is grasses, but it also becomes, you have like your oak, shrub oaks and other medium-sized trees that bring in that darker, green shades into the landscape. And then riparian woodland corridors refer to those areas where water exists more. On our site, there are no perennial water sources, I don't believe. But these would be those places where water is regularly feeding the landscape and therefore creates density of biomass through that existence of water.
Thank you so much, Trevi.
Yes. So I return to this concept of scarcity and plenty. And I show these images just to give you a really good image for how water impacts arid, dry landscapes. And how it impacts it is that it's not there all the time. It's ephemeral. And ephemeral refers to the fact that water comes and even flows, but only during rain events or times when the sky so graciously provides us with that resource. But what's interesting in these images that what I want you to really be aware of and see is how vegetation naturally then grows in a dense or lush fashion, as we might want to use that term, in a lush fashion along these corridors where water flows even only during certain times of the year. Note that our site is in a desert. Yes, there are many geographical relationships, but there is, if this fluctuates yearly, but around 12 inches of rainfall annually in this part of the world. And a very large portion of that comes during the summer through thunderstorms that provide moments of water flow. And most of this happens during the hottest time of the year. So the nice thing is that we can take advantage of this rain when it is hottest and driest. But where it goes, the landscape takes advantage, which is a beautiful thing about the way the earth responds to its own resources. I wanted to show this image. You'll notice there's a little bit of a different term there referring to xero-riparian areas. This refers to those areas where water is not there visible all the time, but it's these low-lying areas or dry streams, they may look like, or washes, we refer to them here. But they're those areas where when it does rain, water flows and or congregates. And it's in these areas that we can see, in particular with this image, just the density of green created. It's not a forest in this case, it's not tall trees under which you can stand, but it is a density and a culmination of a large amount of plants that create biomass. In other words, creating these oases in the environment. The other term you see there is referring to this idea of a natural living sponge. That's one of the design terms that I want to use in this, is referring to these sponges. We know a sponge in the kitchen to be an object that can suck in water and hold it, or soap or whatever, to help us as a tool. In the landscape, we can think of the sponge as these places where we craft. In the case of Lower Campus Diamond Mountain, the landscape crafts by providing these lowland areas where water is able to sit and saturate, percolate, and provide life-giving water to vegetation. So where do we find water and how do we harness it in the ephemeral becomes that question as a designer when we look at a space like Diamond Mountain. And this quote here, "Plant the rain," is one that I've heard given by an individual named Brad Lancaster here in Tucson, who is a great thinker of how to use water, in particular in the urban dry landscape. And it refers to the idea of, rather than just thinking of planting plants, but it's providing places where water can be planted in the ground from rainfall, with the actions of slowing it down and letting it soak into the earth. I'm going to talk briefly about a few sort of methods. The primary focus of what I'll be talking about will be about these passive aspects of basins and swales slowing and soaking the water. But you can also see that there are other methods we can use to be aware of the ephemeral nature of water, to provide ourselves with the tools we need to create our oasis in the desert. These can be active and passive. They can be aspects of containment, reuse, slow, and soak, which I'll use those terms in other slides here. So in particular, I want to discuss this idea of passive water harvesting and how this overlays with the Lower Campus project. In this case, we're referring to the intentional sculpting of the land. And when I say sculpting the land, I'm referring to the built landscape, forming it into shapes of basins and swales, as you can see illustrated in this image. This comes from a resource by Brad Lancaster. And what I want you to note in particular here is the shape of those basins. They're not just holes in the ground, but they're these sculpted, very gently sloped edges, sometimes not even necessarily overly visible to the eye in the landscape, but they are intentionally placed as these areas where water come into and overflow from. And as they overflow, they are allowed to slowly seep and move through the landscape into other areas where water is flowing into. And all along the way, allowing water to even percolate down. And we do see through some examples I'll show you in a minute, how this can really impact the idea of creating density of vegetation, lushness in the desert biomass that we want to create. This is a cross-section drawing or a detail drawing by the same resource that refers to the idea that it gives you an idea of this idea of the changes in planes and where water goes as it moves into these. I don't want to get too much into the technical aspect of this, but in particular, just recognizing how we are intentionally creating these sponges along a path, or in this case, along a change in topography. And this is where I wanted to bring up just even briefly the idea of plant choice. There's been a lot of study done, not by myself, but by others, on when we create these, if we want to refer to them as rain gardens, or gardens for rain, where at different levels, we try to choose the right plants that are appropriate to the environment, but as well as appropriate to the amounts of water that it will have to sustain during a rain event. So you can see that sort of graphically represented here. Also, furthering the conversation of the idea of these sponges is that these sponges are believed by some, and particularly Brad Lancaster, to be containment areas that can hold far larger quantities of rain in a rain event than some of our more active elements like containers, rain barrels, which I'm got in the next slide here, or in another slide. But here's an image of where some of these concepts are shown in action. This is in the city of Tucson, not in out in the landscape like where Diamond Mountain is. However, similar experiences in terms of limitations of water and a desire to use less water. Let's put it that way. And rain is, we want to see where rain goes. And the designer in this case saw where rain was going. In this case, down the street are concrete channels that create rivers in our city during large rain events, and found an opportunity for how to bring that water into the landscape to provide life to this vegetation. And these sponges here, as you can see, there's a large amount of water that fills these spaces, much like a rain barrel or container, and will overflow if overfilled. But while it's overflowing, it's also percolating because of the way it's been designed with the proper use of mulches and natural materials on the ground plane. It does thrive and it allows water to pass through the ground, and therefore, yes, it overflows at times, but it also continues to fill and percolate at the same time. In action through, this is actually Brad Lancaster's residence. I thought this was a really good example of how you can see the difference between a site of scarcity on the right, which was, I believe, his property that he still lives in, which is your typical Tucson front yard there, decomposed granite, gravel, rock from the front of the house to the curb, but through a method of these natural living desert sponges and allowing water to percolate has created this what I will describe in this presentation as lushness, which may look a little different for some of you if you've never seen the desert landscape here, but lushness in particular in the sense of the density and the biomass. And biomass refers to the amount of plants living alongside each other in harmony in this case.
That's incredible, Travis, this before and after.
Isn't it amazing?
It's amazing. Do you know how many years are between the pictures?
I did see it. I didn't write it down though. It's probably 10 years.
Wow.
I might be plus or minus there. I need to check that, but I think that's about right. It might be a little longer, but what's incredible about it is that even regardless of establishment periods, this was almost entirely largely done by rainfall. I'm sure in the first few years there were, drag the hose out there and water some plants, especially trees or larger stock from the nursery. I'm speaking mostly from what I assume. I don't know that specifically, but I do know that he states that this was almost entirely from harnessing the power of the rain and creating these sponges.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. One of my favorite examples of a lot of these principles in action are, you know what, I'm realizing this doesn't have some of my slides in it. Okay, that's all right. We'll be okay. One of my favorite examples of these practices in action actually is at the college that I teach at the College of Architecture, Planning, Landscape Architecture at the University of Arizona. This is the garden that sits at the base of our college. It is an amazing display of biomass and lushness in the desert. It is not only supported by passive water harvesting aspects, it also is supported by irrigation, but it had particular goals for how to integrate certain systems like roof runoff, HVAC condensate. That refers to the exhaustion of moisture from the air conditioning system, is what that term refers to. It's a condensate is not a real word. That's a made up designer term for so, but it refers to that slow leaking amount of water that comes from the air conditioning system. Drinking water, gray water goes into this system, and all of this water is combined into a 12,000 gallon tank, I believe, in the center of the building. And that tank, which because of my lack of slides, I might be missing that in this presentation. I apologize. I'll just use this moment to refer to those active elements of rainwater harvesting, which is capturing water in a permanent facility like a tank or a barrel or those kinds of things. In this case, it helped reduce potable water needs in the establishment period of this landscape by about 83%, I believe is what they've calculated to this point, or calculated during the process. It is well established at this point. What that means is, for instance, in our landscape, considering the idea of establishment of trees and otherwise, I know we have limited water resources, so we may have to look for some very active ways to provide non-potable irrigation resources for these purposes. It was expected that in 7 years, there would be 100% reduction in non-harvested water after establishment period. And I believe that is largely true. The irrigation is used still. I don't know the numbers, but it's largely true that the landscape primarily thrives off of the water harvested into these tanks, as well as just natural runoff. And I'm going to show you some of the elements inside this space. The internal space of this landscape are from my personal view, living in Tucson for about 10 years, this is a space that truly defines the idea of an oasis in the city of Tucson through the use of climate appropriate plants, so desert appropriate plants, such as in this case, mesquite trees, and underlying landscape plants that are appropriate to our space. The idea of the mesquite bosque, excuse me, was used as an inspiration for this. And you might think of an orchard or other ways of how we consider that trees can be planted close together and be a single plant that needs to be established, but provide density of shade through density of coverage over the ceiling or over our heads. But under these trees are also these natural sponges that were planted, and I note here with leafy perennials to make the point of there was intentional choice of types of plants to create a more lush feel, even with desert appropriate plants, trying to create choose those plants like some that you see here on the right. This is Mexican honeysuckle and a kidney wood and some other accent plants in there. But one of my favorite plants, that's why I mention it, especially here. It's so lovely because you can see it's got more of a broad leaf. It gives really that feel of lushness in our environment and can thrive so easily. I mean, that plant was chosen intentionally by the designer. In this case, it was Christy Tenike of Tenike Landscape Architects, because it would provide that lushness and that feel. And it's fed by these passive elements like you see on the left here. This is what's referred to as a swale. This swale is a depression in the landscape, or a lowland, low area in the landscape. It's not intended to be a basin. It's not a bowl that holds water and percolates, but it slows water through the landscape. It's got a flat bottom. It's not just a V shape. Its purpose is not to get water out of the landscape as quickly as possible, but it does allow it to flow through and out of the landscape eventually, if there were a rain event that required that. The use of rocks and boulders are not just aesthetic in this sense. They are there to slow water, direct water, and allow it to percolate and help these trees thrive in the landscape so that they can become the space that they are. This is an example. Did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. You used several times the expression desert appropriate.
Yes, yeah.
Because not many people live in the desert of our audience, so I think maybe if you can have a little bit of explanation, what does that mean?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so desert are okay. Let me restart that. The idea of a desert appropriate plant might be different in Tucson than it is at Diamond Mountain. So I will state that clearly. But what it refers to is it's not necessarily only native plants, though largely myself, I try to stay more in the realm of native plants. But they are those plants that for the sake of establishing in the landscape and thriving in the landscape, do not require large amounts of water. So our idea of a forest or a lush landscape might be that of like banana leaf trees or the jungle aspects and those really large broadleaf plants that of course are beautiful. However, they require a certain climate of consistent, constant rain that would not be appropriate in most cases in our landscapes. And while there are certainly examples of individuals who can take an individual plant or otherwise and care and tend it in the desert and help it thrive, in a broader landscape perspective, trying to choose those plants like the ones you see here, the mesquites, yuccas, agaves in some cases, succulents of some sorts, leafy perennials such as here on the right, once again, this is the Mexican honeysuckle, medium-sized trees like the kidney wood in the background there, palo verdes, which are all trees that we may not necessarily know immediately what those are, but they are native and or appropriate they've come from other climates that are similar and can be sustained in an appropriate way in the desert. Is that an okay description?
Yeah, very, very beautiful. Thank you so much.
Okay. This is an example. So once again, I'm missing slides. So I was going to talk about gray water opportunities from the landscape. I'll just use this slide to talk about that. But this is in my own garden, similar palette, although this has Palo Blancos in here, which is a beautiful medium-sized tree here in the desert, but also using that Mexican honeysuckle. This garden thrives off of gray water, and gray water refers to those water resources we have that we use in our homes a lot. In this case, it comes from my laundry. So when I wash my clothes, I've directed the water to exhaust into the landscape in this case. And this is the lushest portion of my property. Nowhere else on my property does it look like this. And that is due largely to how it is consistently being given this deep drink of water. But it's not, there's some irrigation on my property. This space is not heavily irrigated for if there's times when I go out of town or whatever, and it needs to be sustained. But that drinking of that gray water really supports this landscape. And so one of the aspects of our ideas that I want to have in the conversations in the future is this idea of gray water and how can we harness this? How might we be allowed to harness it for that matter too? So from there, we're going to speak a little bit about creating an oasis in the desert. And before I do this, I was okay with missing slides before, but I don't want to miss slides in this part. So I want to make sure that I'm not sure what I did here. Let me check. Yeah, that's not going to work. I can easily, quickly fix this. I apologize.
No problem. It gives the translator the time to have a sip of water.
Am I doing okay? Too fast?
The translators need to react.
That is so strange. I know what I sent you was the whole thing, so well, I'll bring it up on Google Slides instead of the PDF. Okay, here we go. Can y'all see that?
Yes.
Okay. So this has these slides referring to active elements like barrels and containment, gray water use off structures and human use. This is an example at Avalon Gardens Eco Village outside of Tucson. You can see it's a sizable infrastructure that they have developed here to try to capture as much water as possible for their irrigating purposes. I'll leave it at that. I spoke about this in my own, showing you my own garden, shown here. So creating an oasis at Diamond Mountain Retreat Center. So what are these things, these thoughts, how do they impact the way we think? We want to create an oasis, or at least the idea of an oasis. This moment in the desert where there is a fertile spot in the desert, or referencing the idea of lushness, where water is found. And in our case, creating opportunities to use water. This discussion creates these particular design principles, which this was a really great exercise for me that you asked me to do this, because to this point, as the designer, the only role I've played at this point is creating a vision. So it's been more about just like, what could this look like, but not necessarily taking those steps to define how we get there. And I think it's largely going to be based on some of these design principles and using the methods that we've been discussing here of active and passive water harvesting. But we want to create lushness, not through plant choice in terms of types of plants that are inappropriate, but through density of biomass, or lushness through density of biomass, while keeping with climate appropriate plant species, which we were just discussing a moment ago, that idea. Create fertile, fruitful growth through, quote, planting the rain, as Brad Lancaster would say, and harnessing water efficiently and sustainably. And then plan for, and this is one that I find really important as a further discussion, maybe not so much a discussion for today, but as we plan in the future, plan for establishment periods to not overburden the irrigation system on site there, the resources that we do have for that purpose. And this is the master plan. I'm not going to go into detail with this. I'm only going to overlay these concepts. This is a working document. It is not set in place. I'm not sure how many people in the room have seen or know of the plans around any of this, but this gives you an idea of how in the lower campus, around the student center, in this primary gathering space, you can see the density of tree cover. Loosely, you can see the density of the idea of vegetation on the ground. I'll show you some images in a second that put that in place. But this is that idea of centralizing, creating a sponge network in the heart of the campus. And I went ahead and provided you with this visual reference here of this idea of where does water go and how is it being used in relationship to these conversations we're having. Each one of these outlined spaces could, depending on how we further plan in the future, will likely be those areas where we're directing water from the parking lots, from even the gravel road, from the designed landscape areas, such as the courtyard space on the sort of bottom left portion of your screen there. But every place that we put hardscape is draining into these sponge networks, these depressed landscapes that allow water to slow, percolate, and help vegetation thrive. In that planning in particular is the idea of linking these elements. And I wanted to show you that here. And this is a artist rendering of a potential vision for the first garden you would experience when you walk up to the student center here, where we're using the idea of the desert grassland planted in a dense fashion with sparse plantings of trees, as this is not the main gathering space, but it's more about that idea of loose forestation in this case. But this land would not, it might look flat, or even, flat's not the right word because there's topography here, but it might not look necessarily like there's a series of dug holes and swales. However, the idea would be to promote this concept of these sponges linked throughout the landscape, even under and over hardscape areas, which would be the natural network of what's happening on the ground underneath this vegetation. Really sculpting the land, linking basins and swales to allow water to flow and percolate into the soil. This would be active in multiple spaces throughout the lower campus landscape. Once again, an artist rendering of just a vision for this space, not overly yet defined or planned. But this vision incorporates lushness through density of plants in pockets of the landscape. Like you see here, there's a pocket on the left there of the sidewalk and on the right. And then these spaces would be where there are swales or basins, like the one on the right here. It's almost like a ravine that runs around the edge of this landscape, creating biomass and density of tree canopy as well as vegetation on the ground plane. And in the primary gathering courtyard outside the student center, and as you approach the main entry of the student center, density is achieved on the edges in ways I was just describing. But this is one case where me as the designer, I'm hoping to create a space that it would look different than the mesquite bosque on campus that we had with the mesquite trees that I showed you. We would choose a different species of tree here, but the idea would be these trees that are planted close enough to create this canopy overhead while also allowing flow and movement through the space and areas for people to congregate. But you can see that we're creating that canopy of tree overhead for density while also allowing for, in this case, a hardscape space, or a space where people can stand and walk and gather, communicate with each other, etc. Oh, I will make that note there. I say, since newly planted trees can take up to 7 years to establish. I know from my perspective, we really want to choose those places where we invest those natural resources. Because the larger the tree we plant, the higher the impact it has on those water resources in terms of establishing them. So I know we've talked about tree stock, how large are we planting, et cetera, in the future. And so just being aware of how that can impact our water resources. So I just wanted to note some next steps. We have a vision here. We also have principles that we want to be guided by, but the project is not finished, right? We still need to take these concepts and the vision that we've created to this point and develop a plan past the vision, further establishing these design principles into the landscape, while also achieving the goals of moving people and gathering people through and around the spaces in comfort and within these oases. I might be going too fast there, sorry. And the concept of plant species is not one that to this point there's been enough time given to yet. That just wasn't on the agenda yet, but a next step for sure is to really investigate what are the plant species that we want to provide in these spaces to create this lushness that are site-specific and climate-appropriate plantings throughout the site. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, planning for tree establishment periods and vegetation establishment periods, and what that means for the irrigation system alongside these other passive and active rainwater harvesting methods. So thank you for giving me the chance to talk through some of these ideas, some of these concepts. I I hope that, you know, we can achieve what we really want to do here and create a really beautiful landscape that's climate appropriate, takes advantage of the rain and the infrastructures therein. And I look forward to continuing forward. So.
Thank you so much, Travis. That was beautiful. I learned a lot. I think all of us learned a lot. And this is the starting point. We start with the lower campus, and then we want to explore a little bit up the hill and then the whole valley.
Yeah.
And as Travis said, he is the vision person. He gives us this vision. So we are working also with the newly formed Sky Harvest company, which is working on reducing carbon footprint. And also our architectural firm, Line and Space, will then guide us in implementing stuff. So we have 3 parts of the projects and 3 different parties which support Diamond Mountain there to go from this incredible vision to really getting the trees into the ground and get them watered. I would like to open it. We have a few more minutes left. If you have any question, please let us your question know in the chat.
Should I stop sharing? Do you want me to free the screen?
Yeah. I'm just checking. No, so far. That's the sign of a very beautiful presentation. I can only agree if there are no questions there. So then I would like the time to show you in 2-3 minutes the actual numbers. Let me share. So these are the actual numbers accumulated up till yesterday. Taiwan has over 1 million. Yeah, firework. Yes, I see Shaoxing from Taiwan hopping around. Then the Stupa Dr. Blue Fearless stage, they have done an incredible job in August and September. They are now over 600,000. Singapore and Malaysia are both approaching the 500,000. I'm really curious who is winning the race. The Zamde, the world stupa, is over 300,000. They have also reached at a very nice point. And Japan is with 50,000. In the next slide, if it shows up, you can see by country. So I would also like to mention that Vietnam, which is contributing to the Zamde Stupa, is really doing a very great job, and also the United States. And there you see all the many countries which are contributing. Thank you so much to all the donors. We are creating here an incredible project, which I think will benefit so many people in the next 500 years. It's incredible. What we have accomplished regarding the project this month, we have cutted the tree for the central axis for the first stupa. If you want to learn more about this most important spiritual part of the stupa. Please check out this the stupa series from last month. Stupa, meaning and symbols. The marble for the first stupa has reached the location. So we finished the plan. They were starting to cut the marble for the first stupa. In Diamond Mountain, we have cutted the road to the first stupa place. So we are preparing for groundbreaking. And this month, we need to do a geological survey that the place we chose for the stupa is really appropriate to build it there. So they will dig deep into the earth and measure or everything there if really the place can support the stupa. And so far, I'm quite optimistic that we can do groundbreaking latest in January. That's it for this month. You will find the latest numbers in about 2 days on the stupa update website, as well as the recording of today in all languages as the ones from the last month. I would like to thank you all these kind volunteers, the translators, the tech team, the ACI staff, which is always supporting Diamond Mountain, helping in organizing these live streams. And Travis, thank you so much. That was such a beautiful presentation. I learned so much about the desert, what to take on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
And maybe if you want to take the time in the last few minutes, we got a question. Will the hills be covered with trees and plants? I think that is really something which we all have in mind. Will there be a forest on
Yeah. So this is a conversation we've been having. We've talked about this concept of reforestation. And I think there are challenges to some of that. However, what I would, as a bridge from what I've been talking about, I've been thinking about that project in particular, is this idea of centralizing or creating moments that we focus on. So rather than, yes, maybe over time we develop a plan for how it is reforested, there are trees all the way through the hillside, up the hillside, as we can appropriately create. But the starting point from my perspective would be those moments where people travel to and stop, really focusing on these localized sponge areas. That way, in the implementation and the establishment of trees in particular, which is this conversation, we can be very intentional about where we locate them in density, where we locate them in density, where we locate them in density, and then maybe they disperse lightly from those moments.
Yeah.
So there was an image that we created a while back with how trees would be up there. And I think it would be more about these sort of like dense moments and loosening dense moments, as I just described. But I would say that still has quite a bit of time and thought to go into it. So
Thank you so much, Travis. That reminds me of my own practice. You start at one point and then you do it at another point, and over time it becomes a flow.
Yeah.
And obviously it's very similar by doing reforestation in the desert.
Right.
Thank you so much for being with us. I'm looking forward to work with you. Thank you so much for all our kind visitors and supporters. I hope you have benefited from this talk, and see you next month with Geshe Michael and pilgrim practices, which is really a beautiful topic. Thank you so much. See you next month.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Travis.